Aristocracy, Ilara had long since decided, was nothing more than well-dressed bankruptcy. An elaborate stage play of inherited silks and mortgaged porcelain, where the actors were too proud to admit the theater itself was crumbling. For 7 years, she had been the sole manager of such a theater, Blackwood Manor, seat of a dukedom whose duke was saltwater and memory. The scent of her domain was ink and lemon wax, the sound was the steady tick of the great clock in the hall and the distant bleating of sheep. Today, a soft rain whispered against the tall library windows, blurring the green hills into watercolor. Ilara sat at the massive oak desk, a piece of furniture built for a man twice her size, a throne she had earned not by birth but by sheer, grinding competence. A column of figures in the estate ledger refused to align. The wool prices were down again. She dipped her pen, the scratch of the nib a familiar comfort. Her hand was not the soft, useless thing of a lady. The skin was smooth, yes, but there was a callus on her middle finger from this very pen, a testament to thousands of hours spent wresting order from the chaos a dead man had left behind. A small sound, the soft thud of a wooden soldier falling from a parapet, drew her gaze. On the Aubusson carpet, amidst a sprawling battlefield of his own making, sat Rowan. Her son. He was 6, nearly 7, with a serious brow and hair the color of dark, wet earth. His hair. A perfect echo of the men who had sailed away and never returned. He hummed a tuneless little melody as he righted the soldier, his small world one of perfect, manageable order. Ilara's heart did a strange, familiar clench, a mix of fierce, protective love and a sorrow so old it had become part of her bones. He was the entire purpose of her carefully constructed world. He was the reason the ledgers had to balance, the reason the tenants' roofs had to be mended, the reason she had transformed herself from a frightened, discarded girl into the unyielding custodian of Blackwood. She had been his mother's lady's companion. A poor relation with a respectable name and no prospects. And she had fallen in love with a duke who was all charm and reckless energy, a man who burned too bright. He had whispered promises in the moonlight, his hands gentle on her skin, his breath warm against her ear. Then, in the cold light of morning, faced with the consequence, a whispered, terrified confession of a life growing within her, he had frozen. The memory was a shard of glass in her mind. His face, handsome and suddenly remote. The drawing room feeling vast and cold despite the summer heat. His words. Not cruel, not angry, just dismissive. An inconvenience. I am sorry, Ilara. That is not possible. My apologies, not possible. As if she had requested a second helping of dessert instead of announcing the creation of his son, his heir. He had pressed a small, heavy purse into her hand, a payment for services rendered, she'd thought with a flash of bitter fury, and sailed for the Americas a week later, seeking investment opportunities. His ship, the Dauntless, had been reported lost with all hands in a hurricane off the Carolinas. She had not cried. The hurt had been too deep for tears. It had been a tectonic shift, a breaking of her world's foundation. The grief had come later, a strange and hollow thing for a man who had rejected her so completely. But the rage, the cold, quiet rage, that had been immediate. It had solidified inside her, forming a new kind of spine. She had used the purse he'd given her not to flee in shame, but to survive the first few months after his old, frail father, the previous duke, passed away from grief. With the estate in chaos and no other heir apparent, she had simply stepped in. She had started with the kitchens, then the household accounts, then the tenants. No one had stopped her. No one else wanted the job. Now, they called her Mistress Thorne with a deference that bordered on fear. A sudden commotion from the grand hall shattered the quiet afternoon. Shouts. A woman's shriek, Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. The sound was so alien in the well-oiled machine of the house that Ilara was on her feet in an instant, her hand instinctively going to Rowan's shoulder. He looked up at her, his toy soldiers forgotten, his eyes wide. "Stay behind me," she murmured, her voice low and steady. She was a fortress, and he was the treasure within. She moved to the library door, pulling it open just a crack. The front doors of the manor were wide open, letting in the damp, gray light and the smell of wet earth. Standing there, framed in the doorway like a specter, was a man. He was tall, but shockingly thin, the bones of his face stark beneath a matted, overgrown beard. His clothes were rags, hanging from a gaunt frame. But it was the eyes, the piercing, familiar blue eyes, now hollowed by horrors she could not imagine, that made the breath catch in her throat. The ticking of the great clock in the hall seemed to grow louder, each second a hammer blow against the silence. The staff were frozen, staring as if at an apparition. It was him. Alistair Blackwood, the 8th Duke of Blackwood. The men reported dead for 7 years. The man who had sailed away from his responsibilities. The father of her child. He took a stumbling step forward, his gaze sweeping across the familiar hall, a place he knew that no longer knew him. His eyes were a battleground of confusion, disbelief, and a dawning, terrible recognition. Then his gaze found the partially open library door. It found her. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. She saw the flicker in his eyes. He knew her. The memory was there, behind the sun-bleached hair and the suffering etched into his skin. He saw the former lady's companion, the girl he had dismissed. But he saw her standing in the doorway of his private library, her hand on the gilded handle, not with the deference of a servant, but with the innate authority of a master. Then his gaze dropped. It fell upon the small boy clutching her skirts, the boy who was staring back at him with a child's frank curiosity. The boy with Alistair's own dark hair, his own serious brow. Elara watched as he processed it. The boy's age. Her presence. The location. The equation was simple, brutal, and undeniable. She saw the blood drain from his face, leaving his sun-darkened skin with a gray, ashen pallor. The shock on his face was profound, an earthquake that leveled whatever composure he had managed to cling to on his long journey home. This was the moment she had rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times, in the lonely, dark hours of the night. The confrontation she had both dreaded and craved. In her imaginings, she had been witty, or cold, or shattering. But now, as the ghost of her past stood swaying in the hall of her present, she felt nothing but a vast, cold calm. The old wound was a scar, thick and numb. It no longer had the power to make her bleed. She pushed the library door fully open, the heavy wood swinging without a sound on its well-oiled hinges. She stepped forward, pulling Rowan gently with her. She did not run to him. She did not weep. She did not gasp his name. She met the Duke of Blackwood's haunted eyes, and with the posture of a queen receiving a long-absent, slightly inconvenient emissary, she inclined her head. "Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden, absolute silence of the hall. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "You have been long expected." Then, she placed a hand on her son's head, her touch a declaration. "Allow me to introduce you. This is Rowan. Your son." Alistair felt the world tilt on its axis. The floorboards, solid blackwood oak that he had known his entire life, seemed to shift like the deck of a ship in a storm. The familiar scent of beeswax and old stone was drowned out by the phantom stench of salt and decay that clung to him, a shroud from his lost years. He had dreamed of this moment. Standing in his own hall, the master returned. In his dreams, there was weeping, joyous celebration. There was relief. There was not this. There was not Elara Thorne, the girl he remembered as soft and pliable as warm wax, now standing as if carved from granite. She wore a dress of dark, practical wool, devoid of ornamentation, yet she commanded the space more absolutely than his mother ever had in her finest silks. Her hair was bound up in a severe knot, emphasizing the sharp, intelligent lines of her face. The timidity he remembered was gone, replaced by an unnerving stillness, a composure that felt like a suit of armor. And the boy. The word son struck him with the physical force of a wave. He stared at the child, a miniature of himself, a living, breathing ledger entry from a debt he had tried to settle with a purse of gold and a swift departure. The boy had his eyes, though they held a startling gravity Alistair could never recall possessing. He was looking at Alistair not as a son looks at a father, but as one might inspect a strange insect that had crawled in from the rain. Elara's words echoed in the cavernous silence. "You have been long expected, not, Alistair, you are alive," but a formal, chilling acknowledgement, as if he were a delayed shipment of goods. The sheer audacity of it, the cold power in her tone, was a shock that momentarily eclipsed even the revelation of his son. Mrs. Gable finally broke from her paralysis, rushing forward with a choked sob. "Your Grace. We thought you were gone." Other servants began to stir, a murmur of disbelief and awe rippling through them. Alistair barely heard them. His focus was pinned to Elara. She had not moved. She was a statue of quiet defiance in the heart of his home. His home. He looked from the perfectly polished floors to the dust-free portraits on the walls. He looked at the servants, who glanced from him to Elara, their expressions a mixture of shock at his return and an almost ingrained deference to her. This was not his home anymore. It was hers. He was the ghost, the intruder. He had to say something. The Duke of Blackwood had to speak. But what? The words he had rehearsed for 7 years, commands, inquiries, declarations, all died in his throat, tasting of ash. He was a king who had returned to find his kingdom not in ruins, but running more efficiently than ever under a new, unexpected ruler. His strategic mind, the one that had kept him alive on an unforgiving spit of land for 2,555 days, began to whir. This was a new kind of survival. The girl he had callously dismissed was now the gatekeeper to his own life. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with a brutal irony. He was weak, destitute, a stranger. She held everything, his home, his legacy, and the son he never knew he had. He took another unsteady step. The journey from the coast had taken weeks, begging for passage, for food, his title a madman's claim to anyone who saw his wretched state. He was exhausted down to his soul. "I require a bath," he said. The words came out as a croak, a raw, desperate sound that shamed him. It was not a command. It was a plea. Elara's expression did not soften. She simply gave a short, sharp nod to the petrified housekeeper. "Mrs. Gable. See to it. The Duke's chambers. Have them prepared." Her use of his title was a weapon, distancing him, defining him by a role he no longer knew how to inhabit. She turned her attention back to him, her gaze clinical. "We will have a late supper served in the small dining room. I trust you will be able to join us. Rowan dines with me." It was a command disguised as an invitation. A summons. She was setting the terms of his return. He was to be a guest at her table. In his own house. She then turned, without another word, and guided Rowan back into the library, closing the door with a soft, final click. The sound echoed the closing of a vault. He was left alone in the hall with the gaping servants and the crushing weight of his new reality. His return was not a restoration. It was a negotiation. And he had just discovered, with sickening certainty, that he held no cards at all. The days that followed were a disorienting fever dream. Alistair moved through Blackwood Manor like a spectre, haunting the edges of a life that was no longer his. The ducal chambers had been perfectly preserved, a museum to a man who was supposed to be dead. Yet the rest of the house hummed with a purpose that was entirely Elara's. He saw her everywhere and nowhere. A glimpse of her dark dress disappearing down a corridor. The low murmur of her voice from behind the closed library door as she met with the estate steward. The scent of the lemon verbena soap she used, lingering in a room she had just left. She was the gravitational center of the household, and he was a rogue planet, pulled into an orbit he could not comprehend. Their meals were excruciating exercises in polite hostility. They sat at opposite ends of the long mahogany table in the small dining room, a vast, polished wasteland between them. Rowan sat beside his mother, a small, silent observer, his dark eyes moving from his father's strange, scarred face to his mother's impassive one. Elara spoke to him only when necessary, her questions practical and devoid of emotion. "Is the room satisfactory, Your Grace? Does the cook's fare meet with your approval?" She never used his given name. He was always Your Grace, a title that felt more like an accusation than an honorific. He tried, at first, to assert himself. "I will see the steward tomorrow morning," he announced on the third day. "Mr. Davies is occupied with the north pasture drainage until midday," Elara replied without looking up from her plate. "I have a meeting scheduled with him at 2. You may join us, if you wish. You may join us." The casual, infuriating permission. He had wanted to rage, to slam his fist on the table and declare his authority. But one look at her calm, unyielding face, and the words died. What authority did he have? He knew nothing of the north pasture's drainage. He didn't know who Mr. Davies was, the old steward having died 5 years ago. He was an ignorant king, and she held all the maps. His anger was a damp squib, useless and pathetic. He was forced into the role of observer, and what he observed was a revelation. He began to follow her, keeping to the shadows. He watched her walk the fields with the steward, her head bowed in serious conversation, her hand gesturing to a line of trees or a section of fence. She didn't walk like a lady surveying her gardens, she walked like a farmer surveying her land, her boots sinking into the mud, her focus absolute. He found his way into the library late one night, drawn by a sliver of light under the door. He expected to find her reading poetry. Instead, he found ledgers. Stacks of them. Not just for the household, but for the entire estate. Wool yields, tenant accounts, investments, expenditures. Her handwriting was a model of clarity, the columns of figures precise and ruthless. He picked up one book, the accounts from the year after he had died. The estate had been bleeding money, the finances a tangled mess left by his grieving father. He traced the lines with a finger that still bore the faint scars of making fish hooks from bone. He saw her entries, month by month, year by year. He saw her sell off a failing investment his father had made in a London shipping firm. He saw her renegotiate the wool contracts. He saw her invest in new, hardier breeds of sheep. He saw a slow, brutal, methodical battle against bankruptcy. She had not just kept the estate afloat, she had made it solvent. She had dragged his legacy back from the brink of ruin, one painstakingly recorded shilling at a time. This was not the work of a mere housekeeper. This was the work of a master strategist. A general winning a war of attrition. The respect he felt was grudging, an unwelcome guest in the house of his pride. It was a bitter pill to swallow. The woman he had deemed unsuitable to be his duchess had single-handedly saved his dukedom. A crack appeared in the fortress of his resentment one afternoon. He was in the library, aimlessly pulling books from shelves, the scent of old paper a lonely comfort. Rowan was there, playing quietly by the fire. The boy was trying to build a tower of wooden blocks, but his small hands were clumsy, and the structure kept collapsing with a soft clatter. A frustrated little sigh escaped him. Alastair watched from the shadows of the shelves. He saw the boy's brow furrow in concentration, an expression he recognized from his own reflection. Before he could think, he was crossing the room. He knelt on the carpet, the movement stiff and unfamiliar in his new, well-made clothes. "The foundation is too narrow," he said, his voice softer than he intended. Rowan looked up, startled. He didn't flinch, but his eyes were wary. "You must build a wider base," Alastair continued, picking up two of the larger blocks. "Like this. See? It gives the rest of the structure something strong to stand on." He placed them side by side. Rowan watched, his head tilted. Then, with solemn care, he placed a third block next to them. Together, in silence, they began to build. They constructed a magnificent, sprawling castle, with towers and bridges and walls. For a few brief moments, Alastair forgot he was a ghost. He was just a man on a floor, building a castle with his son. The library door opened. Ilara stood there, a sheaf of papers in her hand. She stopped dead, her gaze falling on the two of them on the floor amidst the wooden ruins and reconstructions. Her face was unreadable, a carefully blank mask. But Alastair saw the flicker in her eyes, a momentary breach in the wall. It wasn't anger. It wasn't suspicion. It was something else. Something complicated and unnervingly vulnerable. She said nothing. She simply watched them for a long moment, the silence stretching thin. Then she turned and walked away, leaving the papers on a side table. The moment was over, but something had shifted. A single stone had been loosened in the wall between them. The thaw had begun, as slow and imperceptible as the melting of a glacier, yet just as unstoppable. The first true storm of autumn arrived a week later, a violent tantrum of wind and rain that lashed the countryside. It tore at the ancient oaks and sent slates skittering from the manor roof. Alastair stood at the library window, watching the trees bend, feeling a strange kinship with their struggle. The island had taught him the language of storms. He knew this was a bad one. The door burst open and Davies, the steward, rushed in, his face pale and his coat dripping onto the priceless carpet. He looked wildly around, his eyes settling on Alastair with a flicker of uncertainty before finding his true north. "Mistress Thorne," he gasped, breathing heavily. "It's the old bridge. The one over the Blackwater Creek. The supports are giving way. If it goes, the entire lower village is cut off, and the miller's cottage is just downstream." Ilara was already on her feet, her chair pushed back. Her face was a mask of sharp, focused energy. "How many men do you have?" "4, mistress." "It's not enough. The water's rising too fast." "I will come," she said, already moving toward the door. "Mistress, it's no place for you," Davies protested. "The wind could take you right off your feet." "I am not made of sugar, Mr. Davies," she retorted, her voice like flint. Alastair stepped forward. "I will go." Both of them turned to look at him. Davies looked relieved. Ilara looked annoyed. "Your Grace, this is not a drawing-room diversion," she said, her tone sharp. "I have spent 7 years securing shelters against hurricanes," he replied, his own voice cold. "I believe I know a little more about wind and water than anyone here. Get me a heavy coat and some rope." Her eyes narrowed, searching his face. He met her gaze without flinching. For the first time, he was not the pathetic ghost or the ignorant landlord. He was offering a skill, a strength she could not deny. He saw the flicker of calculation in her eyes, the pragmatist weighing the asset against the complication. The pragmatist won. "Very well," she said with a curt nod. "Mr. Davies, fetch what he needs. I will meet you at the stables." The scene at the creek was chaos. The roar of the water was deafening, a brown, churning monster that clawed at the stone supports of the old bridge. Rain drove down in near horizontal sheets, stinging like needles. Alastair felt a grim, familiar exhilaration. This was a battle he understood. Nature's fury was a simple, honest enemy, unlike the complex warfare of silent dinners and loaded glances. He took charge, his voice cutting through the storm's howl. He showed the men how to anchor ropes to the ancient trees on the bank, how to use levers to try and brace the crumbling supports with fallen logs. He worked alongside them, the mud sucking at his boots, the icy water soaking him to the bone. He felt the ache in his muscles, the strain in his back, and it felt more real than anything he had experienced since his return. He looked up at one point and saw Ilara. She was not cowering in shelter. She was organizing a second group of men, sending them to the Miller cottage to help evacuate the family. She moved with purpose, her dark skirts whipped by the wind, her face set and determined. She was a commander directing another front of the battle. They were not working together, not really, but they were fighting the same war, side by side. A massive crack of lightning split the sky, followed by an instantaneous roar of thunder. A huge, rotten branch from an overhanging oak, weakened by the wind, tore loose. Alastair heard the sickening crack and looked up in horror. It was falling directly toward Ilara. There was no time to shout. He reacted on pure instinct, the same instinct that had saved him from falling coconuts and rock slides. He launched himself across the muddy bank, tackling her around the waist. They went down in a heap, landing hard in the slick mud, just as the massive branch crashed to the earth precisely where she had been standing. The impact shook the ground. Splinters of wood flew through the air. For a moment, they just lay there, tangled together, his arms wrapped tightly around her. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his chest, or maybe it was his own. Her hair had come loose from its severe bun, and wet strands of it were plastered to her cheek. The scent of her, rain and earth and lemon verbena, filled his senses. He had her pinned beneath him, his body shielding hers. Her eyes, wide and shocked, were inches from his. The armor was gone. The carefully constructed walls had been shattered by the falling branch. In her eyes, he did not see the cool mistress of the manor. He saw Ilara. Frightened, vulnerable, and startlingly alive. "Are you hurt?" he breathed, his voice rough. She shook her head, a small, jerky movement. Her hands were pressed flat against his chest, not pushing him away, but gripping his soaked coat. It wasn't a romantic embrace, it was the desperate clutch of two survivors after a near disaster. A functional, unintentional intimacy that was more potent than any calculated touch. He pushed himself up, helping her to her feet. They were both covered in mud, disheveled and breathing hard. The storm still raged around them, but in their small bubble of existence, something profound had broken open. He had saved her life. And in doing so, he had irrevocably breached the fortress she had built against him. Later that night, the storm had quieted to a steady, drumming rain. The bridge had been saved, for now, and the Miller family was safe in the manor's kitchens. A strange peace had settled over the house, the quiet that follows a battle. Ilara found Alastair in the library. He was standing before the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand, staring into the flames. His borrowed clothes were damp, and he had a long, deep scratch on his forearm from a splintered piece of the branch. She carried a small wooden box. She didn't speak, simply came and stood beside him, placing the box on the mantelpiece. She opened it. It contained bandages, a small bottle of antiseptic, and a pot of salve. "Let me see your arm," she said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual crisp authority. He held it out, and she took his wrist. Her fingers were cool against his skin. The touch was clinical, purposeful, yet it sent a jolt through him. He watched as she carefully cleaned the wound. Her focus was absolute, her movements deft and sure. This was the same woman who balanced ledgers and commanded stewards, now tending to his injury with a gentle precision that felt unnervingly personal. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the rain. "I never thanked you," she said, her eyes still on his arm. "There's no need," he replied, his voice hoarse. She looked up then, and her gaze held his. Yes, there is. The mask was gone. In its place was a weariness he recognized, for it mirrored his own. "You saved my life. You built a life worth saving," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. It was the truest thing he had said since his return. A shadow passed over her face. She finished tying the bandage, her movements becoming brisk again, the walls beginning to reconstruct themselves. But the foundation was cracked. He knew he had to speak now, in this fragile quiet, or the chance would be lost forever. "I have nightmares," he said into the silence. She stilled, her hands hovering over the medical box. She did not look at him, but he knew she was listening. About the island. But not just that. About the sea. The thirst. Forgetting what it felt like to be full. Forgetting what it felt like to be a person. He took a deep drink of the brandy, the fire of it burning a path down his throat. "When I first came back, I saw you, and I saw him. And I felt like I was drowning all over again. I was the Duke of Blackwood. I was supposed to be in control. And I had never been less in control in my entire life. Not even on the island." He finally confessed the immense, crushing weight he had been hiding. "Before I left, I was suffocating. My father's debts, the title, the expectations. I was 24 years old, and I felt like a 100-year-old man in a costume. When you told me about Rowan, it was just one more stone on a mountain I could no longer carry." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for an understanding he did not deserve. "It was cowardly. It was unforgivable. But it was not because of you. It was because of me. I was a boy playing at being a duke, and I was terrified." This was his burden, laid bare. The truth of his failure, stripped of pride and title. He expected her to turn away, to offer a cold platitude and leave him to his ghosts. Instead, she closed the lid of the medical box with a soft click. She turned to face the fire, standing beside him, a partner in contemplation. "I understand being terrified," she said softly, her voice so low he had to strain to hear it. "When the news came that your ship was lost, my first thought, my very first, shameful thought was relief. Relief that I would not have to face you again. That I would not have to see the dismissal in your eyes every day. Then the grief came, and the terror. I was alone, with a child, in a world that had no place for women like me." She picked up a small brass poker, nudging a log in the grate. Sparks flew up the chimney like frantic fireflies. "That terror became a tool," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of its familiar steel. "It became a whetstone. It sharpened me. I built this place, this life, not out of love for the Blackwood name, but as a fortress to protect my son. Every balanced ledger was a stone in the wall. Every repaired roof was a barricade." She turned to him, and for the first time, he saw not an adversary, but an ally forged in a different, but equally brutal, crucible. "Your return threatens that fortress, Your Grace," she stated, a simple fact. "But today, in the storm, you fought for it. Not for your legacy, but for the people who live on this land. For the Millers. For me." The chasm between them had not vanished, but for the first time, they were standing on the same side of it, looking across at the ruins of their past, rather than at each other. The confession of his weakness had not driven her away. It had, impossibly, brought her closer. She saw the broken man behind the ducal title, and he saw the resilient woman forged by the fire of his own failure. A fragile, unspoken truce had been declared in the quiet of the library, under the watchful eyes of the storm. The announcement of a formal dinner to celebrate the Duke's miraculous return sent a ripple of frenzied activity through the manor and the surrounding county. It was Ilara's idea, a strategic move she had presented to Alistair with the cool logic of a general planning a campaign. "They are whispering," she had said, standing across the library desk from him. "The gentry. They see a ghost of a duke and a former companion running his house and raising his son. It is an unstable situation. Power, like nature, abhors a vacuum. We must show them there is no vacuum here. We must present a united front. A united front." The words hung in the air between them. It was a piece of theater, a performance for the benefit of their neighbors, and yet, the idea of it felt less false than it would have a few weeks ago. He had agreed. The night of the dinner, the manor blazed with light. Carriages crunched on the gravel drive, depositing a flock of local peacocks and hens, rustling in silk and dripping with jewels. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, roasting meat, and cloying perfume. It was a world Alistair had once commanded with ease, but now it felt alien, the customs and codes a language he had to relearn. He stood at the top of the grand staircase, waiting. He wore the formal black evening attire that his tailor had crafted with miraculous speed. It felt like a costume, the stiff collar a tasteful noose. He watched the guests assemble below, their faces a mixture of curiosity, awe, and thinly veiled gossip. Then he saw her. Ilara appeared at the end of the upper corridor. She was not wearing her usual practical wool. She was in a gown of deep emerald velvet, a dress that had been his mother's. It was simple, unadorned with the fashionable frills of the other women, but on her, it was magnificent. It turned her from a strategist into a queen. The blackwood diamonds, a heavy, formidable necklace, rested against her collarbone. Her hair was swept up, revealing the elegant line of her neck. She looked regal, powerful, and utterly terrified. He saw it in the slight tremor of her hand as she rested it on the balustrade, the rigid set of her shoulders. This was not her battlefield. The ledgers and the fields she could command, but this arena of whispers and smiles that were knives, this was foreign territory. As she approached him, he saw her take a small, steadying breath. She was putting on her armor. He knew, with a sudden pang of empathy, that the weight of the diamonds on her neck must feel like a yoke. She stopped before him, her eyes meeting his. "Your Grace," she murmured, her voice tight. "Ilara," he said, using her name for the first time since his return. He held out his arm. "They are waiting for their duchess." Her eyes widened fractionally. A flicker of something, surprise, gratitude, fear, passed through them before the mask of composure slammed back into place. She placed her hand on his arm. Her fingers were ice cold. As they began the descent, a hush fell over the hall below. Every eye was on them. He could feel their gazes like insects crawling on his skin, but he could also feel the slight, trembling weight of her hand on his arm. For the first time, they were tethered. A united front. Dinner was a masterpiece of social maneuvering. Alistair found the old rhythms returning, the easy charm, the casual authority. He told a sanitized, but still thrilling, version of his survival, casting himself as a resourceful hero rather than a desperate scavenger. He felt Ilara beside him, a silent, powerful presence. She spoke little, but when she did, her observations were intelligent and precise. He watched the other diners, saw their initial, condescending curiosity about her slowly morph into a wary respect. But the poison was in the air, waiting for an opportunity to be spouted. It came, as he knew it would, from Lady Annabel Finch. She was the daughter of a neighboring earl, a woman of impeccable beauty and vapid cruelty, who had made no secret of her ambition to become the next Duchess of Blackwood before Alistair's inconvenient resurrection. "It is simply remarkable," Lady Annabel trilled, her voice carrying across a lull in the conversation. She directed her venomous smile at Ilara. "How you have managed. One hears you have been practically running the place. Like a very, very competent housekeeper. The Duke must be so grateful to have found things in such tidy order." The insult was perfectly crafted, a stiletto wrapped in velvet. It reduced Ilara's 7 years of toil to mere domestic tidiness, reinforcing her former status as a servant. the table went quiet. Several guests smirked behind their wine glasses. Ilara's back went rigid. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her fork. Alistair felt a surge of cold, lethal fury, an emotion he had not felt since he'd fought another starving man for a turtle's egg on the island. He placed his hand over Ilara's, his touch a silent command to stand down. He then set down his own fork with a deliberate, soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. He turned his full attention to Lady Annabel, his charming facade dissolving to reveal the bedrock of ducal authority beneath. "Grateful, Lady Annabel," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Gratitude is what I feel for a stable hand who returns a lost horse. What I feel for this woman is something for which you, I fear, have no vocabulary." He stood up slowly, his height commanding the room. His gaze swept the table, pinning each of the smirking guests to their chairs. "Let me be perfectly clear," he continued, his voice now like chips of ice. "While I was presumed dead, this estate, my title, my legacy, was bankrupt. It was a house built on sand, ready to be washed away by the next tide of debt my father had accrued. The woman you call a housekeeper did not merely tidy up, she fought a war. She battled creditors, she renegotiated contracts, she rebuilt this house from the foundations up, ledger by ledger, acre by acre." He looked down at Ilara, his expression softening for a fraction of a second before hardening again as he faced the room. "She did this not with the power of a title, but with the power of her intellect, her will, and her courage. She guarded this dukedom with more ferocity and intelligence than any of my ancestors did with a sword. She is not a competent housekeeper, she is the savior of Blackwood." He let that sink in, the silence in the room so profound he could hear the frantic flutter of Lady Annabel's fan. "So, yes," he concluded, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the room. "I am grateful. I am in awe. And you will address her as she is, and as she has been in substance for 7 years, as the Duchess of Blackwood. The mother of my heir." He paused, his final words a public execution. "Is that clear enough for you to comprehend, Lady Annabel? Or shall I use smaller words?" Lady Annabel's face had gone from smug to crimson to a mottled, chalky white. She looked as if he had physically struck her. The social ruin was absolute and instantaneous. No one at the table would meet her eyes. Alistair sat back down. He picked up his wine glass, took a sip, and looked at the guest to his right. "You were telling me about your new hunter, Lord Ashton." The spell was broken. Conversation resumed, stilted at first, then rushed, as everyone tried to pretend the execution they had just witnessed had not occurred. Beside him, Ilara had not moved. He risked a glance at her. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on her plate. But under the table, her hand, no longer cold, found his. She laced her fingers through his, her grip firm and sure. It was a silent acknowledgement. A treaty signed. The united front was no longer just a strategy. It had become real. The last carriage had rolled away down the drive, leaving behind a profound silence that felt heavier than the earlier noise. The house seemed to exhale, settling back into its familiar quiet. In the grand hall, Alistair and Ilara stood alone, the emotional exhaustion of the evening a tangible presence between them. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving a strange, vibrating intimacy in its wake. The air was charged, not with the old hostility, but with unspoken words and the raw, exposed truth of his public declaration. "I should go and check on Rowan," she said, her voice quiet, her gaze fixed on the flickering candlelight. It was a retreat to the familiar, to the one part of her life that was pure and uncomplicated. "He is fine," Alistair said gently. "Mrs. Gable looked in on him an hour ago. He was sound asleep, dreaming of wooden soldiers, no doubt." She nodded, but did not move. The emerald velvet of her gown seemed to absorb the light, making her look both regal and impossibly weary. The heavy diamond necklace glittered at her throat, a beautiful, brilliant cage. He saw her lift a hand to the back of her neck, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. A small, frustrated sigh escaped her lips. "It stuck," she murmured, her voice tight with a tension that had nothing to do with the necklace. He stepped behind her. The scent of her hair, freed from its formal arrangement and now loosely coiled, reached him. He hesitated for only a second before lifting his hands to her neck. His fingers, calloused and scarred, brushed against the soft, cool skin of her nape. A shiver ran through her, a current he felt in his own fingertips. "Allow me," he said, his voice low. He worked at the intricate clasp. It was a delicate, complex mechanism designed to secure a fortune. His touch was as gentle as he could make it, a stark contrast to the rough hands that had once wrestled sharks for food. He was acutely aware of her stillness, of the warmth of her skin, of the subtle scent of her perfume now mingling with the ever-present phantom smell of salt water in his memory. This act, this simple piece of assistance, felt more intimate than the tackle in the mud, more significant than the shared ordeal of the storm. It was a deliberate act of care. A dismantling. The clasp finally gave way with a soft click. The heavy necklace slid from her collarbone, and he caught it before it could fall. The sudden absence of its weight made her sag slightly, her shoulders slumping in relief. He had not just removed a piece of jewelry, he had lifted a burden. He had unfastened the armor she wore for the world. He set the necklace down on a nearby table, the diamonds clattering softly against the polished wood. She did not turn around. "Why did you do that?" she asked the shadows. "Tonight. In front of everyone." "Because it was the truth," he answered simply, his gaze on her back. "It was the truth I was too blind and too proud to see 7 years ago." He moved to stand in front of her, forcing her to meet his eyes. The great hall was dark around them, lit only by a few remaining candles, their small space an island in the gloom. "Ilara," he began, his voice thick with a confession that went far deeper than the one in the library. "When I came back, I was filled with a rage I couldn't name. Rage at the years I'd lost, at the world for moving on. I looked at you, and I saw the embodiment of everything that had changed. You were in my library, at my desk, with our son. You had taken my place. And I hated you for it." Her chin lifted, a flicker of the old defiance in her eyes. "I earned that place." "I know," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "That's what took me so long to understand. I came back expecting to reclaim a kingdom. I found that the kingdom was in better hands than mine had ever been. You weren't a usurper. You were a better ruler." He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently touched her cheek. Her skin was soft. "Real. My anger wasn't about you taking my place. It was the shame of realizing I had never deserved it in the first place. Not like you do." A single tear escaped her tightly controlled composure, tracing a silent path down her cheek. He caught it with his thumb. "I was so hurt," she whispered, the words a ghost of the girl she had been. "You broke something in me that day, Alistair. You looked at me, at our future, and you found it impossible. An inconvenience." "I was a fool," he said, his own voice raw. "A terrified, proud, stupid fool. I ran. It's the great shame of my life. Not the shipwreck, not the years I lost. The moment I let you walk out of that room alone." He looked at the woman before him, the strategist, the survivor, the duchess of his heart long before she was of his house. He saw the strength she had forged from his weakness, the life she had built from his abandonment. And he was humbled to his very soul. "I don't know if you can ever forgive me for that," he said softly. "But I have fallen in love, not with the memory of the girl I knew, but with the woman who stood in my place. With the woman who saved my home. With the woman who raised our son. I love you, Ilara." Her breath hitched. The carefully constructed walls, breached by storms and confessions and public defenses, finally crumbled into dust. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. He lowered his head, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. She leaned in. Their first kiss was not the desperate, fumbling passion of their youth. There was no recklessness in it. It was quiet, deep, and heavy with the weight of everything they had survived. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of shared burdens, of a future acknowledged. It tasted of salt and sorrow, of ashes and triumph. It was not the kiss of a boy and a girl in a moonlit garden. It was the kiss of a duke and his duchess, of a man and a woman who had been to ruin and back. It was grounded. It was real. It was a beginning, forged in the heart of an ending. 1 year later, the autumn sun cast long, golden fingers across the grounds of Blackwood Manor. The trees that had been lashed by the storm were now dressed in fiery reds and brilliant yellows, a peaceful surrender to the changing season. The house itself seemed to breathe easier, the oppressive chill of memory replaced by the scent of baking bread and the distant laughter of a child. The library, once a battleground of silent wills, was now the heart of the home. Alastair and Elara sat side by side at the great oak desk, a shared throne. The estate ledgers were open between them, but the atmosphere was not one of tense negotiation. It was one of easy partnership. The new drainage in the north pasture held perfectly through the spring rains, Alastair remarked, tracing a line on a surveyor's map. Davies was right. Your design was better than the original plan. Your idea to use the stone from the old quarry saved us a significant amount, Elara countered, making a note in the margin of the ledger. Her handwriting was still precise, but it now shared the page with his own bolder, less patient script. The tenants are pleased. On the carpet before the fire, Rowan was no longer fighting lonely battles with his wooden soldiers. He was building. The foundations were wide and strong. He was constructing a sprawling, ambitious city, and beside him, a small, fat puppy, a gift from the millers, chewed contentedly on a piece of rope. Rowan looked up, catching his father's eye. "Papa," he said, the word now as natural as breathing. "The bridge needs another tower." Alastair smiled, a genuine, easy expression that had finally settled on his face, smoothing away the last traces of the haunted castaway. "Does it now? And where do you propose we put it, Chief Architect?" He slid off his chair and knelt on the floor, joining his son in his world of wood and imagination. Elara watched them, her heart full with a quiet, steady warmth that had finally, blessedly, become her new normal. The fortress she had built to keep the world out had become a home that let the right people in. Later that afternoon, they walked the grounds, the puppy gamboling ahead of them, chasing falling leaves. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. Elara had tucked her arm through Alastair's, a casual gesture of affection that was now second nature. His hand rested over hers, his thumb stroking her knuckles. They paused at the edge of the woods, looking back at the manor. The old grey stone seemed to glow in the afternoon light, the windows like warm, welcoming eyes. It was no longer a crumbling theater of aristocracy or a cold fortress of survival. It was a home, alive and breathing. "Do you ever miss it?" Elara asked quietly. "The life you had before? The life you thought you were coming back to?" Alastair was silent for a long moment, his gaze on the house. "I thought I did," he said, his voice thoughtful. "When I first returned, I wanted to turn back the clock. I wanted the world to be exactly as I had left it. I wanted to be the man I was." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes clear and full of a love that still, after a year, had the power to take her breath away. "But that man was an idiot," he said with a wry smile. "He was a boy who didn't know the first thing about foundations. He didn't know what was real." He reached up and cupped her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "This is real," he whispered. "You. Rowan. This life we've built together, from the ruins. I wouldn't trade a single day of the last 7 years on that island if it meant not having this. If it meant not having you, exactly as you are." He leaned in and kissed her. It was a soft, simple kiss, a quiet conversation between two souls who had found their way home, not to a place, but to each other. It held the promise of countless more autumns, of ledgers balanced together, of bridges built from wooden blocks, of a love that was not a whirlwind romance, but a deep, abiding partnership. It was a love built not on sand, but on the solid, unshakable foundation of mutual respect, hard-won trust, and the shared, quiet triumph of a life reclaimed. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, benevolent glow over their faces, Elara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was finally, truly, safe.